Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fall meeting press conference, Unequal Impacts of Heat, Pollution, and Climate Change. I'm Liza Lester from the AGU Media Relations Office. Our panelists today are Susanna Benz from the University of California, San Diego, Allison Grant from the University of Mary Washington, and Angel Su from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We will begin with the panelists giving brief presentations describing their findings, and then we will open it up to questions from reporters. We will end after 45 minutes or when there are no more questions. Reporters, you will not be able to turn on your video or microphone. So if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box at any time. And my colleague Lauren LaPuma will pose it to the panel on your behalf as soon as the Q&A portion begins. Please note that the Q&A function is not the same as the chat, so please put that in the Q&A box. Please remember to also state your full name and affiliation in your question. You can write your question at any time. Immediately after this press conference ends, we will open a 30-minute discussion room for additional discussion with the panelists, and I will post a link to the discussion room in the chat box in just a few moments. Slides and additional materials from this press conference will be posted to the Fall Meeting Media Center. This press conference is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to AGU's YouTube channel, and links for the Media Center and YouTube channel are on this slide. Please bear with us should any technical issues arise. If Zoom webinar goes down for any reason, we will switch to presenting via teleconference line. If this happens, we'll immediately send an email to all the panelists and attendees with information on how to access that line. If you have any technical issues during this press conference, please email us at news@agu.org. And I'm now going to turn it over to our panelists, starting with Susanna.
Hi, hello, my name is Susanna Benz, and I want to start actually by thanking the AGU press team for allowing me to present my research here, and all of you for coming and listening in on these three talks and these three presentations on a topic that I at least find quite important. Today, me and my co-author Jennifer Burney want to try and answer the question, who's feeling the burden of urban heat in the United States, particularly in summer during daytime? Before I do this, can you please go to the next slide? Before we actually answer this question, I think it's important to understand what is urban heat actually. And urban heat simply describes that the temperature and the climate in a city is often different than outside of a city. And most of the time, it is warmer. This is why we talk about urban heat islands. There are a bunch of causes why this is the case. It's quite complex. I just want to mention 4 causes really briefly, so you have like a basic understanding. Starting out with that cities are often darker surfaces. If you drive a car, you might have noticed that if you drive a dark car and park it in the sun, it is hot. It is hot even after the sun is down. Whereas if you have a light colored car, it is cooler a lot faster and also just never gets that hot. There's also, of course, a lot of built up area in a city, and these buildings simply trap the heat in between them. So the heat that enters the city cannot escape. Additionally, you might also know that within city, there's often less vegetation than outside. Vegetation means that there's more water evaporating, which is the same effect as your body sweating. So if there's no water that evaporates, the city can't cool down, the city can't sweat. And if you can't sweat, you're hot, the city is hot as well. And lastly, of course, and this is a surprisingly small reason of all of this, is our own waste heat. We produce heat in our buildings, in our bodies, in everything we do. And this heat is just an additional heat source that city experience, but everything outside does not. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? What you're seeing here now is the urban heat in summer days, the surface urban heat in summer days in the United States for every census tract. This means along the horizontal axis, you have on the one side, on the left side, all the places where the city is actually colder than the rural area, than in the background. On the right side, the city is hotter than the rural background. And depending on where on that plot it is, the further it is. Oh, I think you see me mirrored. So if I go this way, that's my right. How high it is just tells you how many census tracts are exactly these locations. So we see there are quite a few places in the US where the city is about 10 degrees Celsius hotter, but there are also some where it's 5 degrees colder. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to show 2 examples of this. If you look at Phoenix, all of Phoenix is still very, very hot. But the background, the rural area surrounding Phoenix, is actually hotter than the city center. Miami, on the other side, is also a pretty hot city, but here the city center has more heat than its rural surrounding. This difference means, if we go back, oh, sorry, can you go back one? This difference means that if you go back to our initial questions, who is feeling the burden of urban heat, we can't just look at the entire US at once, because then people in Phoenix will feel less heat than people in Miami, no matter their income, their race, their ethnicity, their education. So we split it up for each county. And now please go to the next slide. Thank you. And this is the example what it looks like for Miami. So this is again the same as before. The further right you are, the hotter your area is compared to the rural background, but now split up for the rich neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods in Miami. And what you see is that the poor neighborhoods are significantly hotter than the rural backgrounds. The rich neighborhoods in yellow here are still warmer than the rural background, but it is not as extreme. So there's a difference between those two. Rich neighborhoods, rich individuals living in these neighborhoods experience less urban heat in summer daytime than their poor neighbors. Now, we didn't just run this for Miami, and can you go to the next slide, please? We've run this for every single county or every single urban county in the US. This is in total about 400 counties. If you click on play, you'll notice we've developed a Google Earth Engine app. I've been told you can access that link from the media center after this presentation. So you can just go to your hometown, type in your hometown, just search for it, click on it, and it will tell you information about income, race, education, age, whatever you want to know, how just urban heat in your county is. Okay, if you do this for every single county, and can you now please go to the next slide, you'll generate a graph that looks like this. What you are seeing here now is every single dot here represents one of these 400 counties, urban counties within the United States. The further left they are on this plot, the more hotter the poor neighborhoods are compared to the rich neighborhoods. If they are on the right, it means the rich neighborhoods are hotter. Not all of these dots are significant. The size of the dot actually tells you how significant this data point is. And the color just tells you how big the difference between rich and poor is. So how much income is between rich and poor. And what you find is that more than 80% of all urban counties display significant classist disparities in urban heat. If you go one slide further, we've done the same for racist disparities. And this is now in addition to these classist disparities. So we're controlling for income, and this is assuming that everybody just earns the same amount of money. Still, we have 50% of all urban counties displaying significant racist disparities. So for 50% of all urban counties, your non-white neighborhoods are hotter than your white neighborhoods, even controlling for income. For fairness, I want to say on the right side of this plot, they are about 13% of all counties. So in 13%, we have actually white neighborhoods controlling for income that are slightly hotter than the non-white neighborhoods. But 50% is by far the majority. So lastly, I want to answer why this is the case. Could you go one slide further, please? At the beginning, I told you about 4 reasons why urban heat islands might be a thing, why urban heat islands exist. For 3 of those, you find significant differences between the disadvantaged communities and their advantaged neighbors. For 1, disadvantaged communities live in higher population densities than their neighbors, so they experience more of our own waste heat. They live in neighborhoods with less vegetation, so their neighborhoods cannot sweat. And lastly, they live in neighborhoods where there's more built up areas. So there's more heat trapped in disadvantaged neighborhoods. This was all for today. Thank you so much. Can you go to the last slide for a short summary? We tried, that's like one slide too far. We tried to answer today who's feeling the burden of urban heat. We found widespread racist disparities, widespread classist disparities, and could link all of them to differences in the urban design. And yeah, there should be an email address for me, but now it's Allison's email address. So just email Allison, I guess. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sorry about that, Susanna.
No problem. It was the same as the very first slide, so yeah.
Next up, we have Allison Grant.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Grant, an undergraduate researcher from the University of Mary Washington. Before I begin, I would like to recognize my amazing co-authors, Dr. Pamela Groth, Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, and Dr. Bev Wilson for their expertise and mentorship. Today, I'm here to talk to you about a historical discriminatory housing practice known as redlining and its impacts on urban heat. Could you go to the next slide? So, redlining was a racially motivated and discriminatory housing practice that started in the 1930s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC. Essentially, this corporation gave neighborhoods security ratings to deter investors from giving mortgage loans to residents. Here is an example of a historic HOLC map from Richmond, Virginia. The grades ranged from A to D, with A being the best and D being the most hazardous. Neighborhoods with a higher African American or minority population were typically given this hazardous rating or were redlined. This process shaped lending practices and development for decades, and despite it being outlawed in 1968 under the Fair Housing Act, communities are being exposed to the impacts of climate change. My co-author, Dr. Hoffman, has extensively explored this issue by analyzing present-day land surface temperatures in over 100 formerly redlined cities in the United States. Inspired by his research, I took an alternative approach to look at how land surface temperature has changed over time from the 1980s to the 2010s in order to assess the impact of extreme heat from climate change on these vulnerable cities. Could you go to the next slide? So my research specifically focuses on the change of land surface temperature from the 1980s to the 2010s in formerly redlined Virginia cities in the summertime. So here are my results showing the mean difference in land surface temperature between these A-graded or non-redlined areas, represented by the blue data points, and the degraded or redlined areas, represented by the orange data points. My results are consistent with previous studies, such as one conducted by my co-author, Dr. Hoffman, in that redlined neighborhoods have significantly higher land surface temperatures than non-redlined neighborhoods. Although where my results differ is that I looked at this trend over a much longer period of time from the 1980s to the 2010s. And I found that long-term trends were not significant, suggesting that the difference between the 1980s and 2010s in HOLC graded communities has existed for decades and has locked in these disparities. Could you go to the next slide? So you may be wondering what exactly is making these redlined communities more exposed to the impacts of urban heat. Well, redlined neighborhoods were unfortunately poorly developed, and they contain heat risk related land cover or impervious surfaces. Examples of these impervious surfaces would be roads, buildings, and sidewalks that have the ability to absorb excess energy from the sun during the day and then slowly release it in the evening, which raises atmospheric temperatures. The high density of these impervious surfaces is a driver for these urban heat issues. So in my research, I also looked into impervious surface coverage and found that from 2001 to 2016, impervious surface coverage did increase in these redlined areas, but the change was not significant, which correlates well with the fact that land surface temperatures did also not change significantly over time. Although where there was significant differences was between the redlined and non-redlined areas. For example, in Richmond, Virginia, the degraded or the redlined areas were 27.4% more impervious than the non-redlined areas in 2016. And this gap was apparent in the other Virginia redlined cities as well. Could you go to the next slide? So why does all of this matter? Well, like you can see on this graph here, global land and ocean surface temperatures have been increasing exponentially due to climate change since the 1800s. In the United States, heat-related fatalities are greater than any other weather disaster or natural hazard each year. And additionally, the frequency of heat waves is expected to increase. For every 1 degree Celsius increase in heat wave intensity, there is a 4.5% increase in mortality risk. Communities adversely exposed to the impacts of extreme heat will have more issues dealing with it as the consequences of climate change worsen. Could you go to the next slide, please? So the Center for Disease Control has developed a social vulnerability index that combines a variety of socioeconomic factors to assess a community's resilience to stressors. So here's an example from Richmond, Virginia. On the left-hand side, you have the formerly HOLC graded communities with that red color representing the redlined areas. And then on the right, you have the census tracts with varying vulnerability scores. The image aims to display how these formerly HOLC graded communities align with current CDC vulnerability scores. Formerly redlined communities are more likely to have higher vulnerability. Not only are they more exposed to extreme heat, but they are also more exposed to elevated pollution levels. Residents in these areas are more likely to have cancer, asthma, suffer from pulmonary disease, and other serious health implications. Additionally, residents in these vulnerable areas typically are economically unstable. They can't provide themselves with proper air conditioning or healthcare, which is important for mitigating these impacts of extreme heat. The legacy of redlining has locked in these disparities, giving a rise to these dangerous health issues. And could you go to the next slide, please? So ultimately, why do we need to care about this? Well, populations of people are being disproportionately exposed to extreme heat and are subject to heat-related illnesses. More than 600 people are killed each year by extreme heat. This is not just a matter of environmental issue of climate change, but it is a social justice issue. Climate change is inevitable, and we are already seeing the impacts of it today. But what we need to do now is to figure out where these communities are struggling and what needs to be done to make them more resilient to the impacts of extreme heat. These solutions not only need to be accessible, but they need to reflect the needs of individual communities. Thank you. That's all I got.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Oh, went straight to the end. Okay. I'm Angel Xu. I'm an assistant professor, formerly at Yale and US College in Singapore, but recently I have relocated to North Carolina and will be joining the Department of Public Policy and the Environment, Ecology, and Energy program at UNC Chapel Hill. I also direct a research group called the Data-Driven EnviroLab, and we seek to apply quantitative, data-driven approaches to pressing environmental questions, primarily at the intersection of climate change and urbanization. So today I'll be presenting one of our studies that uses satellite remote sensing data combined with socioeconomic data also at the census tract level to evaluate inequalities in urban heat island exposure in major US cities. And I'm very lucky to have one of the co-authors of the study, the main architect and mastermind behind the urban heat island intensity database that we developed, TC Chakrabarty, who's also on the line. Can we go to the next slide? So as both Susanna and Allison mentioned, environmental justice and the unequal distribution of environmental pollution or benefits as the result of systemic racism has become an important topic of research. Low income or marginalized communities are often forced to live in close proximity to landfills, industrial sites, also major roads, and this exposes them to polluted air and water and causes them, as Allison mentioned, to a greater burden of health effects. So previous research has shown that poor and minority populations are often exposed to higher levels of air pollution, contaminated water, and waste. But there have been much fewer studies that have evaluated whether disparities exist in urban heat exposure. Actually, it was very heartened to hear my co-panelists also working on a similar topic. So specifically, whether the burden of the urban heat island effect, which measures the temperature differential between urban and rural areas, falls more on some populations over others. And for policymakers, as Allison mentioned, urban heat island intensity is of particular interest and concern because more than half of the global population lives in cities. And this share is expected to increase in the coming decades. And urban areas are hotter than the natural landscapes that they've replaced. And so it's in many ways a measure of the anthropogenic contribution to local temperature variation for which policymakers actually have control. But so far, there have only been a few small scale case studies that have shown disparities in urban heat island intensity distribution with single cities or just among selected groups. Although evidence suggests that extreme heat related morbidity and mortality in cities disproportionately affect marginalized groups, there's been little research showing whether or not these groups have systemic and pervasive disproportionately high heat exposure due to the urban heat island effect. Instead, research that links within city differences in heat exposure to socioeconomic factors has typically been done on a small scale study basis on an ad hoc manner. So for example, we published a study last year in Environmental Research Letters that looked at 25 cities, and we found that in 18 of these, including Copenhagen, urban heat island intensity tended to be lower for higher incomes. But why haven't there been more studies that have looked at systemic impacts, disproportionate impacts of urban heat island or urban heat? Well, there are several reasons. Methodologically, there are challenges and also data issues. So one obstacle has been the difficulty in consistently defining urban boundaries for the purposes of calculating the urban heat island effect in a way that aligns with administrative areas for which socioeconomic data are often collected. If we go to the next slide, we can see that in terms of data, there are two primary approaches to measuring the urban heat island effect. One is at the canopy level, which is illustrated here in the dotted lines. And these rely on air surface temperatures from weather stations or other in situ measurements. And then the other method is measuring urban heat island at the surface layer. And so that's derived from satellite measures. That's in the solid line here. So it's derived from satellite remote sensing of land surface temperature. And you can see just in the fluctuation, it can be a lot more variable than the canopy layer. But often weather station data and data available to measure urban heat island at the canopy are limited or unavailable. And so TC developed a database assessing surface urban heat island intensity for every US city using satellite remote sensing measures of land surface temperature. So if you go to the next slide, thankfully, we also have a Google Earth Engine app that TC developed. And so you can go to it and take a look at the urban heat island intensity data at the surface level, and also census tract information to compare side by side how the urban heat island effect varies according to census tract along sociodemographic variables, including race and ethnicity and income. And we've also done age, but that hasn't been built yet into the app. And so we focused our analysis on urbanized areas, which the US Census Bureau defines as densely settled regions with more than 50,000 residents. And so this database comprises more than 55,000 census tracts grouped into 497 urbanized areas. And this covers approximately 78% of the US population. So for this particular study, and we're presenting a poster tomorrow, we decided to focus on the 175 cities in the US with a population of over 250,000. And in the summer months of June, July, and August, when surface urban heat island intensity is most pronounced during the day, and when mean temperatures are generally higher than other periods throughout the year. And so it may have the most relevant health impacts. And in terms of the socio-demographic variables, we included race and ethnicity, and also income relative to how the US Census Bureau defines poverty level, and age as our one measure of socioeconomic vulnerability to heat exposure related health effects. And so you can also see the link to our Google Earth Engine app on this slide. But going to the next slide, I want to walk you through a couple of our key findings. First of all, we found that major disparities in urban heat exposure exist for different sociodemographic groups. So this is a figure showing the distribution of average urban heat island intensity exposure for different groups in the cities we evaluated. And thanks so much to Susanna for explaining what a density distribution, a histogram, and probability density is. So I don't have to. So you can see, we see the same types of patterns in the distributions comparing different socio-demographic groups. So you can see that in most major US cities, populations shaded in red are exposed to higher urban heat island intensity than the populations shaded in blue. So for example, in the first panel, in panel A, more cities are exposing communities of color to more than 2 degrees Celsius of urban heat island than their white counterparts, which on average are exposed to much less urban heat. The same pattern exists when we compare wealthy populations that are 2 times above the poverty line with those that are below the poverty line. Interestingly, as you can see from these distributions, that we don't see much difference between the distributions in urban heat for below poverty populations and all people of color, despite previous research that shows that for other environmental indicators like pollution, race is often the stronger predictor of exposure. So we find that these distributions are virtually identical, despite the fact that only 10% of the US population actually lives below the poverty line. And in terms of age, this was an interesting finding as well. we found that we didn't see much difference in terms of heat exposure for populations under 5 or over 65 when compared to the rest of the population. So you can see in panels E and F that those distributions overlap, and they're virtually very similar. But when we combined race with age, we found similar patterns exist as if comparing race alone, as you can see here in panels G and H, where very young and elderly people of color are also disproportionately exposed to higher urban heat. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that we found some interesting spatial patterns in unequal exposure to urban heat. So here in this map, we compared urban heat island intensity for white and people of color, where in all but 6 cities, or 97% of the total, communities of color, which are illustrated here in the triangles, are exposed to an average of a full degree Celsius higher of urban heat compared to their white counterparts. The magnitude of this effect is actually highest in the Northeast and colder climates. One of the only cities where we don't actually see greater heat burden placed on people of color is in McAllen, Texas. So it's at the southernmost tip of Texas, where there's simply a higher proportion of white residents living in census tracts. Going to the next slide, we can see in 94% of cities, populations below poverty are exposed to higher urban heat island intensity compared to populations 2 times above poverty. And then going to the next slide, we can see that as before, exposures for populations of color and below poverty are roughly equal. So the circles and the triangles are roughly an equal mix here in this map. But patterns of exposure vary by city. Low income and minority populations are not necessarily equally disproportionately burdened in cities. So if we go to the next slide, we can see a side-by-side comparison of the percentage of Black residents by census tract in purple on the left and below poverty in teal on the right for Greenville County, South Carolina. This is actually where I grew up, where I was born in my hometown. And what's interesting is that you can see that on the left, the Black population is highly concentrated in the warmest census tracts in the city. So in dark red and orange, while looking at the right in teal, the poor population is more widely dispersed to cooler areas away from the city center. So these patterns are quite different, where you can see that the census tracts with the highest proportion of Black population are more concentrated in the warmer areas, but the census tracts with higher levels of people living below poverty are more evenly distributed. If we look at Baltimore, Maryland, by contrast, in the next slide, you can see that the poorest census tracts tend to be the warmest, while the Black population is much more evenly spread through the city. You can see that in purple. And then when we take a look at the last panel, and these are some of the underlying drivers that both Susanna and Allison pointed to, the greenest areas within a city tend to be the coolest. And these areas also have the lowest percentage of below poverty residents. So we can see that, and in a previous study that TC led, access to green space has been found negatively associated with median income. So poor populations are often living in higher density, less green areas. And research has also found that homeowners often value cooler temperatures and green space. So then these local temperature differentials become capitalized into housing prices. And so what we hope that policymakers and urban planners can take away from this study is that disparities in urban heat exposure as a direct result of urban planning and design, environmental racism, and the policies such as redlining that Allison mentioned do in fact exist. And now we have the evidence and the quantitative data to show that these patterns are not isolated to case studies or to ad hoc anecdotal evidence, but actually they're widespread, pervasive, and persistent. Many cities often don't take into consideration the spatial location of where the most exposed populations are living when they design climate mitigation policies or strategies, for example, and whether areas that present increased socio-demographic vulnerabilities, such as high age or high minority population, are also happen to be coincident with areas exposed to higher temperatures. So going to the last slide, this is my contact information, our website, and encourage you to explore this data in more detail at our virtual poster session tomorrow. So thank you so much.
A big thank you to our panelists for sharing their work with us, and we will now open it to questions from reporters. As a reminder, only registered reporters may ask questions. If you'd like to ask questions, please type your question into the Q&A box, so not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and my colleague Lauren will pose it to the panel on your behalf. Please give your full name and your affiliation in your question. This session will end at 11:45 a.m. or when there are no more questions, whichever comes first.
No questions yet, but we'll give everyone a minute to type them in if they'd like to. Okay, looks like there are no questions at this point. Oh, no, sorry, there is one from Craig Miller at KQED. Thank you, Craig. He asks, the disparity of 1 degree Celsius doesn't sound like a lot to most people. Can you offer some perspective?
So I'm guessing that's to me. Thanks so much, Craig, for that question. So that's basically just an average. So in some cases, there are census tracts where communities of color are exposed to as much as 5 or 6 degrees Celsius higher than white counterparts or the equivalent sociodemographic comparison group. And so this is really averaged. And so while it doesn't sound like a lot, as we know, in terms of climate change, we are already 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels of temperature. And the Paris Agreement goal is 1.5 degrees. And so I think that is still quite significant when you think about it in terms of the global context and where we're trying to contain global temperature rise. So I don't know if Susanna, you have if you wanted to add more to that.
No, I agree. You're like absolutely right. We're looking at means here. So in my case, we looked at mean summer temperatures. So on average, it would be 1 or 3 or 5, depending on a degree warmer, which means in the very hot days of the summer, it is probably even more than this 1 degree. And like on the cooler days of the summer, the difference is not that big.
Yeah, that's right. And I should also mention that the baseline also really matters. So if you're living, for example, in a much cooler climate in the Northeast, for example, 1 degree may not make that much of a difference. But as we know that the impacts of heat are not necessarily linear. And so if you're living in a really hot city like Miami, for example, that additional degree Celsius could be the difference between 40 and 39. And so then that could really make a huge difference. So it definitely depends on which part of the country you are in and what kind of climate. So that's one of the reasons why we also separated our results by climate zone, because yeah, you could be, if you're living in a really cold climate, you're like, oh, 1 degree Celsius is great. It's actually means that I don't have to wear a sweater in the summer. And so, but in different areas, actually that additional, it's not linear. It could be an exponential impact due to that 1 degrees.
Okay, and a follow-up question from Craig. I've seen heat mortality figures much higher than 600 per year, as high as 12,000 per year for the US. Is there any consensus on this?
Is that to Allison or?
I believe that's to the whole panel.
Okay.
Anyone
Yeah.
who wants to handle it.
Okay. Well, Allison, if you want to go first.
Well, I had that piece of information in my presentation, but as far as I know, I mean, that's just the number that I've seen, but I was told, I mean, at least in the research I've done, that it's been 600 or more. So it doesn't surprise me that you also came across 1,200.
That was definitely not aimed at me, but kind of, I'm not sure if I'm allowed this, but linking it to another question that is currently open, there's just also, it's very difficult to disentangle the health effect of heat, because heat often coincides with bad air quality and all these other basic issues. So both numbers might be correct when just considering different impacts to be caused by heat.
Yeah, I would echo what Susanna and Allison said. It's extremely difficult to disentangle the different health impacts and the drivers of those health impacts due to heat. So they're often comorbidities and comortalities that then become intensified and amplified in the mix of urban heat. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I think we're all interested in this particular question, because it's not just heat directly alone that's leading to these health outcomes. It's heat combined with a sensitivity or sensitivity to, or like a predisposition to, asthma, for example, or diabetes, or which affects the body's ability to hydrate and to perspire, for example. So I'm not a health expert, but yeah, from my understanding, we looked at the CDC data, and so they do have officially published statistics, and I have seen numbers also higher than 600. I think 39% of heat-related deaths happen in individuals over 65, and I think there are several thousand of those alone every single year in the United States. But yeah, I'm happy to send you the CDC data that we used for our study if you're interested, Craig.
Sort of bouncing off of what Angel was saying is that a lot of residents in these areas have these underlying conditions, and they don't have the resources in order to mitigate the problems that they're having. So they're a little bit more susceptible to things like heat, whereas people who are a little more financially stable and have access to resources might be able to manage extreme summertime temperatures better.
You panelists. So our next question is from James Dacey, freelance writer. Apart from the city boundary issue, what other reasons are there for the lack of urban heat island studies to date?
I assume Angel has something to say as well, but I'll start out with, I think a lot of the issue is that both of us that did this large scale study here used satellite data here, because there's just a lack of data in large parts for air temperatures particularly. And we have satellite data now for 20 years, and it just takes a little bit of time and computer efforts as well to be able to calculate these on a large scale, such as all of the US or even go globally. So yeah, just missing data is probably the biggest issue. And I expect we are going to see more of those studies in the coming years now that we do have satellite data available, and yeah, people are getting around to actually analyzing it.
I would agree with Susie. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Allison.
I was going to say, I agree with Susie as well. Also, I use satellite data looking at land surface temperature, and a lot of times you need to look at data that has less than 10% cloud cover in order to get accurate measurements. And it can be challenging, especially looking at data from the summertime. If there's lots of storms, you're going to get a lot of cloud coverage, and you're not going to be able to find accurate temperature readings of those land surface temperatures.
Yeah, 100% agree with both Susanna and Allison. It's the data issue, and I think that's no coincidence that both Susanna and TC developed these Google Earth Engine apps, because Google Earth has really done a lot to make cloud computing a lot more accessible, and they've ingested a lot of these satellite remote sensing data sets and made them much more easy to access. No offense to NASA and the USGS service, but it's much more easy to access the full archive of all of this satellite data and to be able to process it also using their cloud computing technology. And so that has really, I think, done a lot to make it easier to analyze our urban heat island over such a long time frame, and then also over a large spatial scale. I think for us, in looking at our global study, so this is part of a larger study called the Urban Environment and Social Inclusion Index that we have developed over the last several years. And so globally, I think, the lack of access to the air temperature and weather station data, I think that's certainly an issue. And then one of the things that we really struggle for, and TC's done a lot of methodological work to use to define urban boundaries based on what he refers to as a simplified urban extent, using remote sensing and land cover data to be able to consistently measure on a global scale. But I think one of the other challenges in using that approach is that then it's less useful for policymakers, and you're not necessarily able to join then that information with socio-demographic data, like the data on race and income, which is also, I think, very difficult to come by, particularly in contexts where that data is not necessarily publicly available like it is in the United States. And so I think that shifting and looking at the census tract or where socio-demographic information is available, and then being able to use a tool like Google Earth Engine to then combine and fuse those sources of data together is incredibly useful. And so, as Susanna mentioned, I think we will see a lot more of this, and hopefully be able to increase the resolution in the time series to then be able to look at, as Allison has started to do, looking at long-term trends over time, and then being able to relate this in the context of climate change.
Looks like that's all the questions so far. Let's give it another minute. If anyone has any final questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. Okay, I think that's it. No further questions. Oh, sorry. Actually, no. James, I beat you to it. Okay, one more question from James Dacey, freelance. Can you say a bit more about solutions to this problem?
Can you be more specific about which problem?
The heat island effect, the urban infrastructure.
If it's all right, I'm just going to start answering this because kind of another study of mine, we actually looked a little bit into this, how much mitigation is possible. And then there are like 50 million other studies out there that look at this. So I by no means the only expert in the room here. A lot can be done with more vegetation. This is, of course, depending on how much water you have. You don't want to have vegetation and use all of water to water your trees. And in the end, yeah, nobody has something to drink. So still, even if you consider rain-fed vegetation, there's a lot room for improvement. So just plant a tree or 5, and this will be actually super helpful. It's literally that simple. So urban design is the big issue here, and then it of course costs money and space and room, and probably the rents will go up if you actually design a better city, which is why this is also complicated and not as simple as, yeah, everybody plant a tree. But yeah, plant a tree.
Well, I would caveat Susanna's point about tree planting, because I think it definitely depends on which part of the world you're in. And so I was just living in Singapore, for example, and they have done an amazing job on tree planting, but also it's incredibly humid. And so if you plant a lot of trees, also you may be increasing evapotranspiration and also increasing humidity as well with depending on what types of trees. And so I mean, of course, albedo management. So albedo meaning surface reflectance. That's the _1 answer to managing the urban heat island effect. And so there have been studies, as Susanna mentioned, looking at the impacts of cool roofs. So like white, reflective, highly reflective surfaces versus green roofs, for example. And some of the research that I've seen has shown that that's one of the #1 ways to help mitigate the urban heat island effect. But I mean, just to give a shout out to Singapore, I mean, they've really done a huge amount in terms of thinking about building design to encourage urban canyons and airflow throughout urban areas, to also control traffic, because of course urban heat is generated through cars and automobiles. So they've limited the number of cars and licenses that they give out. And so they've really restricted the number of vehicles at any given. So there's actually no traffic ever in Singapore, which is pretty incredible. And so that also is an urban heat management strategy. And so, yeah, so urban form, building, design, transportation, and then, yeah, certainly green spaces, trees, and then cool roofs, highly reflective surfaces and pavements. And then I would also say building materials as well. So ensuring that buildings are well insulated, or in the case of the tropics, they actually can breathe. So that also helps to mitigate the urban heat island effect. So yeah, but it's definitely, I think, geographically contextual and specific depending on where you are in the world. And so that's one of the conclusions that we also highlight in our study, is that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to urban heat island management. You have to really consider where you are and like what's feasible. So as Susanna said, it may not be feasible to plant a bunch of trees or uproot a whole population of people so that you can create a park for other justice and social concerns. And so really trying to consider, but at least like by providing the data in a database and an app like we've done, then you can see what other cities might be similar and similar background conditions, climate conditions, and hopefully learn from each other and figure out what best practices might work.
Okay, looks like there are no more open questions.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today, and this will conclude our press conference. We are now going to open a 30-minute discussion room for additional questions and discussion with the panelists. And in this discussion room, you can chat directly with the panelists using your own video and audio. The link to this discussion room is in the chat box now, along with the meeting ID and password. If you have any questions or issues connecting, please email us at news@agu.org. Our next event, a briefing on listening to a quieter ocean, in the Pandemic to Track Impacts on Marine Life will take place at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.